Forget what you think you know about the Vikings. Forget the horned helmets, the endless raiding, the barbarian myths. Because today we're digging into the Viking story that was buried, silenced, and never taught in schools. This is not just about war. It's about politics. It's about empires. And it's about a forgotten world power that once held the fate of Europe in its calloused hands. This is the untold history of the Vikings. Most people imagine Vikings as bloodthirsty savages screaming into battle with horned helmets and axes. But here's the twist. That image is mostly a fabrication of 19th century romantic nationalism and Hollywood. Horned helmets? Pure fiction. No archaeological evidence supports this. In fact, the famous horned helmets came from Celtic and Germanic ceremonial gear, not Viking warfare. The term Viking itself isn't even an ethnic group. It refers to an activity. To go a Viking meant to raid or explore by sea. These weren't just warriors. They were farmers, traders, explorers, engineers, and some of the most innovative seafarers the world has ever known. They developed revolutionary ship designs that could navigate both open seas and shallow rivers, technology that wouldn't be matched for centuries. The Viking warrior stereotype? It emerged from Christian chroniclers who had every reason to demonize their attackers. Medieval monks described them as heathens from hell because they targeted monasteries, not because they were inherently evil, but because monasteries were undefended treasure troves. The Vikings didn't just attack England and France. They reached North America 500 years before Columbus. Vinland, an entire Viking colony discovered in modern-day Canada at L'Anse aux Meadows. Archaeological evidence shows they had workshops, housing, and even attempted agriculture. They also reached Baghdad, served in the Byzantine military, and created major trade routes stretching from Iceland to Constantinople. While they did raid monasteries, they also made sophisticated trade agreements with the Abbasid Caliphate, Slavic kingdoms, and Frankish empires. Here's the shocking truth. Vikings brought Arabic silver into Scandinavia, changing their economy forever. The largest hoard of Abbasid coins was found in Sweden. Over 85,000 Islamic coins have been discovered across Scandinavia, more than in most Islamic countries themselves. The Vikings created the Varangian Route, a medieval superhighway connecting northern Europe to the Byzantine Empire. They'd sailed down Russian rivers, portage their ships between waterways, and emerge in the Black Sea. This route was so important that Byzantine emperors hired Viking mercenaries as their elite bodyguards, the legendary Varangian Guard. These weren't just raiders. They were medieval, multinational corporations with trade networks spanning continents. Recent genetic research has exploded old myths. Turns out, many Vikings were not just Scandinavian. They were a blend of Celtic, Slavic, Finnish, Baltic, and even Central Asian lineages. The 2020 Nature study analyzed DNA from 442 Viking-era individuals across Europe and Greenland. The results were staggering. Vikings from Norway had significant Irish and Scottish ancestry. Danish Vikings showed Slavic and Baltic genes. Swedish Vikings had Finnish and Eastern European markers. Even more shocking, 2 Viking individuals buried in Denmark had no Scandinavian ancestry whatsoever. They were genetically Southern European and Central Asian. This means the Viking world was multi-ethnic, fluid, and surprisingly inclusive for its time. Vikings weren't just genetically diverse, they were geographically mobile. The study found that many Vikings were immigrants who adopted Norse culture, language, and burial practices. This wasn't conquest, it was cultural assimilation on a massive scale. Another myth shattered. Vikings were not an all-male society. The famous Burko warrior tomb, long assumed to be male, was DNA tested in 2017. It was a woman, buried with full military honors, strategy pieces, and 2 horses. Norse mythology features strong female figures, like Freya, goddess of war and fertility, and Skadi, goddess of winter and hunting. Some sagas and runes reference gender non-conforming individuals, even ritualized transformations during shamanic practices called seer. The Burka warrior woman wasn't an anomaly. Archaeological evidence suggests female warriors were more common than previously thought. Weapon graves traditionally assigned to men are being re-examined with modern techniques. Isotope analysis of teeth reveals many male Viking warriors had female dietary patterns for childhood. Saga literature mentions female warriors like Lagerthe and Herveyr, once dismissed as fiction, now supported by archaeological evidence. Perhaps most fascinating is seer, a Norse magical practice that involved gender transformation. Male practitioners called Simon would adopt feminine clothing, mannerisms, and roles during rituals. This wasn't shameful, it was spiritually powerful. Even Odin himself practiced seer, despite it being considered women's magic. This suggests Vikings had fluid concepts of gender centuries before modern discussions. The Norse people had no alphabet until they adopted runes, but their oral traditions were so detailed that some sagas described genealogies going back 20 generations. These are epic stories of migration, murder, honor, and law. And they're not just myth. Many match real archaeological sites and family trees. History is written by the victors, they say, but Viking history was spoken by the people. Vikings developed sophisticated memory techniques that modern scholars are only beginning to understand. Kinnings, complex metaphorical phrases that aided memorization. Alliterative verse, rhythmic patterns that made stories easier to remember. Genealogical chaining, linking family histories to major events. The Landnámabók, or Book of Settlements, contains over 3,000 individual names and their family connections, all preserved orally for centuries before being written down. Runestones weren't just grave markers, they were medieval newspapers. They announced political alliances, trade expeditions, legal disputes, and religious conversions. Over 6,000 rune stones survive across Scandinavia, creating a database of Viking society that's more comprehensive than most medieval civilizations. You've heard of England, but did you know that half of England was once ruled by the Vikings? The Danelaw covered nearly all of northern and eastern England. York was called Jorvik, a thriving Viking city with advanced infrastructure, leather workshops, and international trade. In Ireland, they founded Dublin, Cork, and Waterford, cities that still exist today. And let's not forget Rollo, a Viking warlord who became the first Duke of Normandy and ancestor of William the Conqueror. That means the British royal family is descended from Vikings. The Danelaw wasn't just conquered territory. It was a parallel civilization with its own legal system based on Norse law, administrative structure organized around wapentakes instead of hundreds, economic system based on silver unlike the rest of Anglo-Saxon England, and cultural practices including Norse naming conventions, art styles, and religious syncretism. Archaeological evidence from Jorvik reveals a cosmopolitan trading center with workshops producing everything from amber jewelry to silk textiles. The city's Coppergate excavations uncovered evidence of international trade reaching as far as Central Asia. Perhaps most overlooked is the Viking foundation of Russia. The Rus were Scandinavian traders who established Kiev as a major trading center, created the Rurikid dynasty that ruled Russia for over 700 years, and developed the river-based trade networks that connected northern Europe to Byzantium. The primary chronicle explicitly states that Slavic tribes invited the Vikings to rule them, saying, "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us." Vikings had laws, and some were shockingly progressive. Women could divorce, own property, and even inherit wealth. They had democratic assemblies called things, where free men and sometimes women voted on disputes. Punishments? Harsh but systematic, outlawry, compensation, or public shaming. Not always just bloodshed. The thing was more than a court, it was democratic governance. All free men could speak and vote. Women could testify and sometimes vote on family matters. Slaves could appeal for freedom under specific circumstances. Foreigners could claim protection under guest right laws. The Althing in Iceland, established in 930 AD, is considered the world's oldest parliament. It dealt with everything from murder cases to trade disputes to land ownership. Viking women had legal rights that wouldn't appear in other European societies for centuries. Divorce could be initiated by either spouse for specific reasons, including impotence, cross-dressing, or abuse. Property ownership was protected even after marriage. Inheritance rights allowed daughters to inherit when no sons existed. Business operations could be run independently by women. The Gragas, or Grey Goose laws, from Iceland contained detailed provisions for women's legal agency that were remarkably progressive for the medieval period. Unlike other medieval societies that relied heavily on physical punishment, Vikings preferred economic compensation. Wergild, or man price, varied based on social status and circumstances. Property damage required exact replacement or equivalent value. Theft demanded double compensation. Outlawry, or social exile, was reserved for the most serious crimes. This system created economic incentives for peaceful resolution while maintaining social order. By the 10th century, the Viking world began to change. Christianity crept in. Kings like Harald Bluetooth converted. Yes, that Bluetooth. But it wasn't just belief, it was politics. Christianity opened doors to alliances, marriages, and trade. The old Norse gods didn't disappear overnight. They blended, resisted, and re-emerged in folklore for centuries. Harald Bluetooth's conversion around 960 AD was calculated diplomacy. It legitimized Danish rule in Christian Europe, opened trade relationships with the Holy Roman Empire, provided marriage alliances with Christian royal families, and offered administrative systems proven successful in Christian kingdoms. The gelling stones that Harald erected combined Christian symbolism with Norse artistic traditions. Physical evidence of cultural synthesis. Archaeological evidence reveals gradual religious transition. Thor's hammer pendants appear alongside Christian crosses in the same graves. Runic inscriptions invoke both Christ and Thor for protection. Church architecture incorporates Norse decorative elements. Christian saints acquire Norse mythological attributes. The Gosforth cross in England shows Ragnarok, the Norse end of the world, carved alongside Christian crucifixion, suggesting Vikings saw parallels between mythologies. Religious blending created fascinating combinations. Odin became associated with Saint Michael, both warrior figures. Thor was compared to Saint Olaf, both protectors against evil. Freya merged with Virgin Mary, both maternal figures. Valhalla paralleled Christian heaven, both warrior afterlives. This wasn't forced conversion. It was cultural evolution that preserved Norse values within Christian frameworks. The Viking Age didn't end because they were defeated. It ended because they evolved. Viking kingdoms became Christian monarchies. Trade replaced raiding. Internal rivalries and climate shifts pushed settlements to collapse, especially in Greenland. The Greenland colonies, settled by Eric the Red, vanished due to climate change, overgrazing, and isolation. The medieval warm period from 950 to 1250 AD enabled Viking expansion, but the Little Ice Age from 1300 to 1700 AD destroyed their most remote settlements. Greenland colonies couldn't adapt to shorter growing seasons. North Atlantic storms made regular supply voyages impossible. Inuit populations expanded southward, competing for resources. European demand for Greenlandic goods like walrus ivory and polar bear furs declined. Archaeological evidence from Valsey Church shows the last recorded Viking activity in Greenland was a wedding in 1408, then silence. Viking kingdoms transformed into medieval monarchies. Denmark, under Valdemar the Great, became a Christian empire. Norway unified under Harald Hardrada and later Magnus the Good. Sweden evolved into a Baltic trading power. England integrated Danish legal traditions into Anglo-Saxon governance. The Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 marked the symbolic end. Harald Hardrada's death represented the last great Viking invasion. As political Viking culture disappeared, intellectual preservation began. Icelandic scholars like Snorri Sturluson recorded Norse mythology. Saga literature preserved historical narratives. Runic inscriptions continued in remote communities. Folk traditions maintained Norse customs under Christian frameworks. The Viking Age ended not with conquest, but with successful integration into medieval European civilization. In modern times, Viking imagery has been twisted by nationalism, Hollywood, and even white supremacist movements. But the truth? Vikings were global citizens. They embraced diversity, commerce, exploration, and even spiritual pluralism. They shaped Russia, England, France, and Ireland, not just with the sword, but with ships, stories, and systems. But here's perhaps the most mind-blowing revelation that will change how you see Vikings forever. They had a sophisticated understanding of navigation that rivals modern GPS technology. Vikings could navigate across vast oceans using crystals. Yes, actual crystals. They used calcite crystals called sunstones that could locate the sun's position even through thick clouds and fog. Recent experiments by scientists have proven these crystals work with 95% accuracy, allowing Vikings to navigate the North Atlantic with precision that wouldn't be matched until the invention of the magnetic compass centuries later. They also used ravens, releasing them mid-voyage and following their flight patterns to locate land, because ravens always fly towards shore. This wasn't primitive seafaring. This was cutting-edge medieval technology that enabled them to reach America, establish trade routes to the Middle East, and dominate the seas for over 300 years. The Vikings didn't just stumble upon new lands. They engineered their discoveries. And here's something that will blow your mind about Viking medicine. They were performing complex surgeries while the rest of Europe was still believing illness was caused by evil spirits. Archaeological evidence from Viking burial sites shows they successfully performed trepanation, drilling holes in skulls to relieve pressure from head injuries. But that's not the shocking part. The shocking part is that bone analysis reveals these patients survived and lived for years afterward, with clear signs of bone healing around the surgical sites. They had anesthetics made from henbane and alcohol, surgical tools made from the finest steel, and understanding of wound care that prevented infection. Viking sagas describe bone setters who could repair fractures and wound healers who could stitch cuts so precisely that scars barely showed. While medieval European doctors were prescribing prayer and bloodletting, Vikings were performing life-saving operations with success rates that wouldn't be matched until the 19th century. But perhaps the most stunning revelation is about Viking women's role in exploration. They weren't just staying home while men sailed away. Recent DNA analysis of Viking settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and even North America reveals that women made up nearly half of the original colonists. These weren't just wives following husbands. They were active participants in exploration, bringing essential skills like textile production, food preservation, and agricultural knowledge that made long-term settlements possible. The Icelandic sagas mention female navigators, female shipbuilders, and female expedition leaders. One saga describes Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir, who not only sailed to North America, but gave birth to the first European child born in the New World and later made a pilgrimage to Rome, making her one of the most well-traveled individuals of the medieval period. Archaeological evidence from the Oseberg ship burial in Norway shows it contained 2 women buried with an entire ship, suggesting they held positions of such high status that they commanded their own vessels. Viking exploration wasn't a boys' club. It was a family business where women were equal partners in humanity's greatest adventure. The romanticized Viking image emerged from 19th century nationalism. German Romanticism created the horned helmet imagery. Richard Wagner's operas popularized mythological Vikings. Nazi ideology appropriated Norse symbols for propaganda. Hollywood films emphasize violence over cultural complexity. Modern white supremacist groups have distorted Norse symbols, despite historical evidence showing Vikings were ethnically diverse and culturally inclusive. Genetic studies reveal Viking heritage across unexpected populations. 25% of Icelandic men carry Scandinavian Y chromosomes. Irish populations show significant Norse ancestry. English surnames reflect Danish settlement patterns. Russian nobility traced lineages to Varangian founders. The Viking diaspora created genetic and cultural influences that persist across modern Europe and North America. 21st century archaeology has revolutionized Viking studies. Metal detector discoveries reveal extensive settlement patterns. Isotope analysis traces individual life stories. DNA technology rewrites demographic assumptions. Underwater archaeology uncovers shipwrecks and harbors. The Somme ship burials in Estonia, the Jelestad ship in Norway, and the Ardnamurchan ship burial in Scotland have rewritten Viking chronologies and social structures. We were told the Vikings were bloodthirsty barbarians, but they were astronomers, shipbuilders, poets. They were mothers, sons, warriors, and traders, a civilization that once connected worlds from Newfoundland to Baghdad. They created legal systems that protected women's rights, democratic assemblies that gave voice to common people, and trade networks that spanned continents. They were explorers who reached America 5 centuries before Columbus, diplomats who served Byzantine emperors, and storytellers who preserved their history in sagas that still inspire us today. The real Viking legacy isn't conquest, it's connection. They built bridges between civilizations, created inclusive societies, and left cultural innovations that shaped modern democracy, legal systems, and maritime technology. Their true story reminds us that history is complex, civilizations are diverse, and human achievement transcends simple narratives of good versus evil. And now that history is finally being told. If you made it this far, thank you. You've just experienced the real Viking story that textbooks ignored and Hollywood distorted. Now, share this, because authentic history deserves a real audience. Like this video if you learned something new. Comment with what surprised you most. Subscribe for more untold stories from history. And if you want to dive deeper into Viking archaeology, genetic studies, or saga literature, check out the research links in the description. Remember, history isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to remember. Let's choose truth over myth. You know where to find us.